Hello and welcome back to Hive Prometheus. Today I think it's time that we go over a new tier list. It has been a couple months now. The Munitorum field manual has come out, points have changed, the meta is starting to shift, and I wanted to get more of a community take on units that are probably going to be seen more often as we telegraph into the future, predicting some of those top armies that we're going to have to contend with. And I wanted to have more of a well-rounded take on units that can be seen in detachments other than the one that I've necessarily been playing most often. So I went over this tier list with a couple of the guys in the Tyranid Discord just over a chat for about 2 hours, and we came up with what you will see up right here. All right, so this is going to be a little bit of a longer video, but I'm going to try to get through these as quickly and fluidly as possible. First off, I want to thank Nova86, Teddy, and Blackstar from the Tyranid Discord who helped me to go ahead and order these. I couldn't have done it without them, honestly. I would have had a very different take on it. So going from the beginning of list construction, regardless of detachment that you're playing or bringing, we just ordered them from Always Taken, often seen or used in 3 or more of the detachments out of the 6 that Tyranids have, often used in 2 detachments, used often in 1 detachment, fringe use, and we've got some problems for the ordering of our units. Starting at the top, you're building a Tyranid list, you got to make sure you have a Biovore in there. That's just how it is. We do great on secondary scoring. It's 75 points that ensures that you can score behind enemy lines, deploy teleport homer, fixate signals, engage all fronts. There's something like 5 or 6 of these secondaries in the 16-card tactical deck that you can potentially score just using the Biovore while seeding mines, and it ends up just being something that we have to bring. I know some people in the community don't like the idea that Tyranids are hamstrung win rate-wise from having other better data sheets or abilities because of this, but that's something that we can look forward to potential change in July with the data slate. Second of which, regardless of detachment, you see exocrines, whether it's Unending Swarm, Nexus, Crusher, Invasion, you're going to see exocrines in almost every list. It's some of our best quality shooting. It's for a cheap price. It's on a great T10 body. It is an excellent unit all around. There's not much I have to do to butter it up. It knows it's good. It stays up there and always taken. Going down to often used gargoyles, now that they've seen the increase in points, as opposed to seeing people spam 2x10 or 3x10 squads of them, I think you're probably realistically going to see 1 to 2 of them, specifically in detachments like Unending Swarm that need them for the regen or for a turn or 2 of move blocking, and to have that extended reach. But a lot more people are now teching into Harmagons for the relative speed and the reduced costs. Maliceptors, again, have an incredible shooting profile. The Strength 10 AP2 3 damage is something that we rarely see in our spread of units. We don't have a lot of high damage, high strength shooting. They're also on an incredibly tough body, T11 4-up invuln with 14 wounds, and their Encephalitic Diffusion aura, giving -1 a hit, is some of our only defensive tech that we have outside of Invasion's Feel No Pains. Maliceptors continue to just be a really great use of 170 points. So they're highly suggested in any list that you're building. Going down to the Neurotyrant, I think it is our most point-efficient, tough body that also has some great utility and uses. The Neuraloids to give Synapse with an 18 is pretty important for a lot of things that want to use stratagems. Having a Flamer on an HQ at 18-inch range is really good as an Overwatch threat to protect your backfield. I think for the points costs and the relative impact that has on the game and the small profile in order to hide it, it becomes one of our best HQs in the game. This one might be a little bit of a surprise, somebody going forward, but I believe that Rippers at 20 points for a single 40mm base, that for the same reason that a Biovore can score 5 or 6 of our secondaries easily by seeding a mine, we have redundancy in that plan if our Biovore is killed using Rippers. They can deep strike. They're hard to screen just because they have such a small profile. And if you do end up losing them, not much was actually lost. Going on to Lictors, I was actually talked up from this position because of the points drops. Most people are moving away from the Battleshock package, Lone Ops, specifically the Death Leaper and the Neurolictor, so Lictors, for their specific cost, have come up. Having a cheap Infiltrator that still has feeder tendrils to go and threaten minor characters with the precision ability, and also still has a relatively small profile and still moves 8. It has just a good coupling of rules. The only thing that I think is direly needed is a 5-up invuln. Maybe that's part of the reason why he's so cheap, but I think a 5-up invuln on him is justified as he had in the index. Gene Stealers are next. They are one of our only units that has devastating wounds consistently with the Broodlord attached. They have a scout move, they move quick, they're infantry, they can move through walls. There's a lot of terrain types that lend themselves to Gene Stealers being very handy. Again, Broodlord normally is only being coupled with Gene Stealers. I don't think there's a single person that is using a Broodlord as a solo character. That is the only reason why he's slightly lower on the list. But these are normally a dual package. Death Leaper is a little lower than Lictor. Normally, I would have put him higher. However, for the additional 25 points on top of a Lictor, the -1 to leadership is only synergized if you have other things that are going to be taking off of Battle Shock. And a lot of us are now moving away from Battle Shock as a mechanic, specifically in our game plan. It's kind of sad because that's our army rule, and we aren't interacting with it a whole lot. The only way in which we are interacting with it is having the Neuro Tyrant for the -1 on Shadow in the Warp. In that same vein, Neurolictors, they're a little lower than Death Leaper, but they still are very tanky. They're 7 wounds, 4 up, Invuln T5, which is great for 80 points, but the reliability of being able to battle shock something within 12 of your command phase and not the end of the movement, like the Tau are able to do, is slightly lacking. So if there is a change to this model, I would like it to go back down 5 points to 75, and I'd like the battle shock ability to be at the end of the movement phase, just to extend its range and our versatility a little bit. Hormagaunts, as I mentioned earlier, are 20 points less than Gargoyles at this point, have a slightly reduced range threat-wise. They also have a slightly lesser ability to steal objectives. However, they are one of our few things that advances and charges. They're just cheap enough that if I do have to throw it onto an objective and try to survive after a combat, a couple of those bodies can still out-OC my opponent to steal a primary. They're very useful in that aspect. Moving on to our Pyrovore, it did go up points in our last data slate from 30 to 35, but for 35 points, it is very tanky. It's T6, 5 wounds, 3 up armor. The acid spray strips cover, and that ends up being very useful for things like our Exocrines and our Maliceptors, which have AP2 and AP3. Against things in cover and potentially Armor of Contempt, we need to be able to keep every pip of AP possible. So for 35 points, it's very well used, and you do see them in a multitude of lists. Going into the first unit in the often used in 2 detachments category, we have the Tyranid effects. I am specifically only referencing the Tyranid effects with the Rupture Cannon and the Acid Spray, as the third variant is not really used. I think the toughness of the body at T12, 2 up armor, 16 wounds, and the Ablative Carapace to be able to blank at least one incoming attack that is allocated to it is very good. I think that you're seeing it in the majority of a couple lists. You see it in Assimilation. Michael Del Toro was using in his assimilation list that went 5-1 at Scorched Earth in Arizona. I'm using it in Crusher Stampede. People are teching it into Vanguard lists, and you are oftentimes seeing it sometimes in Invasion and in Nexus. So it almost made the cut for often used in 3+ detachments, but because of the relative cost and the potential of how the meta could shift, we decided to put it in the first category of often used in 2 detachments. After that, we have Old One-Eye. Old One-Eye is still great as a solo character. It's one of our better melee threats and as a rapid ingress target. However, with the speculation that Orcs, specifically the Bully Boys list, is going to be an upcoming threat, Old One-Eye can only potentially kill so many bodies, and we think that other tech pieces to specifically reduce the output of Orcs, Tau, Thousand Suns, and other armies are going to be much more important. So he's come down a little bit. Next up, we have both of the Tyrants. We were arguing a little bit on which one of the Tyrants was more often used now, but now specifically looking at Vanguard, Nexus, and potentially Crusher, I need to run this list. The -1 attacks that the Flying Hive Tyrant can give to a unit within 12 doesn't even have to be in combat with them. On a 2-up, ends up being really useful if you have them also next to a Maliceptor for -1 to hit. Being able to take a Knob Squad and put them down to 1 attack instead of 2 on a non-WA turn and making them -1 to hit neuters their damage output considerably. Beside him is the Foot Tyrant. The Foot Tyrant is still incredible in Invasion to be able to give that Assault aura. He can give you a lot of battle tactics for free, and giving him the enhancement so that he has the 5-up Feel No Pain and the 4-up Feel No Pain after he's taken a wound. Ends up being a lot of points at 260. However, taking him down completely can only be done by certain factions reliably. After that, surprisingly, we actually come to the Psychophage. He had a large point decrease from 125 to 95. I think now passively he even is all right just sitting in the back, providing Feel No Pains. He doesn't even necessarily have to go and use his OC3 body or the relative tankiness for his points. He is now our cheapest monster in the range. I do think we live in a little bit of a funny world that Thousand Suns might be one of the top table armies, and he also has one of the few things that has anti-Psyker dev wounds against them. I do think that you're going to start seeing Psychophages sprinkled into more and more lists, but specifically right now in Crusher and in Assimilation, they are very useful. Going down from there, we have the Norn Emissary. I am using him in Crusher. He's well used in Nexus. He fits the description of often used in multiple detachments. However, you're not really seeing him sprinkled into Invasion, Unending, or Vanguard. His points are not really justified there. And specifically, those detachments rules don't really target his abilities or help him do what he wants to do normally, which is just declare his favorite objective, sit on there, have OC 15 and a 5 up, feel no pain. I think for 275, he's roughly fair, although his damage is anemic. I really would have liked to have seen his points go down by 10 or 15, and then I think he becomes a really interesting choice for more detachments. As the final unit in this row, we have Zoanthropes. Their points going down from 110 to 100 per 3 makes them an interesting anti-tank choice. However, I don't think for the damage that they can afford, the relative toughness is justified as much as the Tyranid effects. Being toughness 5 and having a 4 up invuln is good. However, you have to tech into other pieces to make them defensive, such as the Venomthropes from Rouse 1 to hit, and a Psychophage for the 6 up Feel No Pain. So their defensive bonuses are actually enhanced more so with the addition of other units, whereas the Tyranid effects can be a standalone and just sit on the back objective and tank shots. Going down to the next row of often used in one detachment, we have melee warriors in the Winged Tyranid Prime. You're normally seeing those coupled together in Vanguard and sometimes in Invasion. It really depends. Their points going down makes them more point efficient than Gene Stealers. However, they don't have a devastating wound ability. They are more point efficient as softer targets, which could be very useful as a trade piece against orcs. However, I think their relative point value, because of the Winged Tyranid Prime being 65 points, it's a useless tax on an already expensive unit, and realistically I would have liked to have seen the Winged Tyranid Prime go down 10 or 15 points to about 50. Up next we have Unryan's Leapers. You're seeing them very often in Vanguard. They're well used, and specifically because they're an infiltrator and they can move up as a first line of offense, letting your other bugs come up behind them. For 75 points, they seem to be pretty good for what they do. Beside them, we have Termagants. Termagants are our third battle line in the list, specifically because they don't move as quickly as gargoyles, and the reactive move is D6 inches. I would have liked to have seen the reactive move potentially changed to D3 plus 3, but that is something that would be normally fixed during a data slate, so we can see if that is affected in July. After that, we have the Haruspex. The Haruspex is often used in Assimilation Swarm. I've seen it used a few times in Crusher. I've used it myself, but not really seeing it spread into multiple detachments like Invasion, where it potentially could make use of its 18 attacks. Beside the Haruspex, we have Venomthropes. Venomthropes give a -1 to infantry, which is still very much used in Unending Swarm, and you do sometimes see in Assimilation. Then again, we're not often seeing it used in multiple detachments, so that's why it wasn't in the column above itself. Tyrant Guard had their points reduced from 95 to 85 for 3. I think for 170 points, potentially having 24 wounds of T8 ends up being pretty interesting, especially in Assimilation, and I think the ability to regen models back can be something that is very useful there. The Termagant is in the same row as the Termagants here. I really anticipate seeing this potentially in Assimilation or Unending Swarm, but I don't know if upcoming we will see it in both of those lists. I could be wrong. So below that we have Neurogants. I think Neurogants are really only being run in Nexus to extend the synapse range so that you can afford giving imperatives to more units. I do like that they're 45 points, and I've thought about putting them in Crusher if I had to shave an additional 20 points off of a Hormagant squad or 40 points off of a Gargoyle squad to afford myself some rippers, but I'm not quite at that point yet. Below that, we have the Norn Assimilator. You're realistically only seeing the Norn Assimilator because of the Armor of Contempt ability in Nexus. The 2-up armor in cover with Armor of Contempt allows you to ignore the first 2 pips of AP. It's one of the only ways we keep him alive, so that's why we see him lower on the use often one detachment. The other detachments, specifically because he's outclassed by the Norn Emissary for his 4-up invuln, and he's 15 points cheaper, is part of the reason he's down here. The Carnifex is down here in used often in one detachment because he's only coupled with Old One Eye in Invasion. Otherwise, you are not running him as a solo monster. He's still too expensive at 125. I would have liked to see him go down to 100 points, and then you could potentially use him as a single body to move to objectives and be an annoyance, even though he only hits on 4s. Going down to Fringe use, I have Barbgaunts as the first unit because their points did go down to 55 from 60. I think they're going to be a tech piece that you will put into lists specifically if you have a problem with infantry-heavy opponents, specifically with orcs. Bully Boys and Green Tide could be a problem. I don't think it's necessarily for the damage that the Barbgaunts can do, but for the reduction in the movement, advance, and charge that you're going to give to one unit at a time. I think that you'll see one of these sprinkled into a couple lists as a tech piece. Similarly, Raveners for 75 points are still very good. They're one of our only units that can go into reserves and come back. If you're able to put them into reserve and come back out and do an action and potentially threaten the backline, I think that they can make their points back. Screamer Killers, although they had a large point reduction in the previous season, we did see a lot of use out of them, but I think now you're only really using them in select cases, potentially in Nexus. I've used them in Crusher. But now that we're abandoning a lot of our Battle Shock tech, we're no longer taking the Winged Tyranid Prime with the Durshard of Karis for the -1 leadership. Death Leaper is no longer in the list, and we're not investing so much in Neurolictors. You're not seeing Screamer Killers on the table nearly as much. For the points, they are pretty good, but I would have liked to have seen them drop by 10 points to 135, and then they become cheap, spammable monsters, kind of like the Exocrine, that will more than likely still die. Molochs are down here as well. I think for 145, they have an interesting ability to do mortals when they come onto the battlefield, and you can keenly select your targets based off your positioning when they come in because of the 12-inch aura, but for 145 points, they're not quite at a spammable point level, just like the Screamer Killer. I would have liked them to see them have dropped 5 or 10 points. Next to him is Swarmlord. Swarmlord did come down to 240 points from 270. However, for those point values, is 100 points more expensive than Old One Eye. His melee is arguably worse, and the Vect ability and the additional CP generation is still not worth a 100-point premium over Old One Eye. Next to Swarmlord, we have the two Forge World pieces. We have the Barbed Hyrule and the Scythe Hyrule. They're still 340 and 330 points respectively. There are so many points. Yes, they have some excellent melee and some good shooting, but the relative size of their bases makes it hard to maneuver on dense terrain boards like UKTC, WTC, and some GW layouts. So they're relegated to fringe use. I think they might not even be seen in a lot of competitive lists just because of the large investment. You expect these units to perform, and if they don't, you're missing out on a lot of other things you could have. Trigon is pretty far down here because additionally, he has an interesting ability to be able to deep strike outside of 3 inches, but he doesn't have a shooting ability that would justify him popping up immediately, shooting, and then gaining some value. He realistically has to come into a place where he can hide, survive a turn, and then get a movement to charge because of his melee. And we already have a saturation of 3 damage weapons in the army with Exocrines, Maleceptors, and with Screamer Killers, which are higher up in fringe use anyway. The Spore Assist for 145 is also down here because you do end up seeing it used in assimilation because you can use the Spore Mine's detonation to heal a unit. But that is probably the only place we see that used right now, and I don't know if that's going to be a continual use into the future. And last but not least, in the fringe use category, we have our last two Biotitans. We have the Hierophant and the Harridan. The Hierophant is slightly more useful because it's large enough that it can actually touch multiple objectives. You can also, in Crusher, use the Corrosive Viscera stratagem to do the 2d6 deadly demise on purpose, so you can set him up to be a large nuclear bomb. You cannot do that with the Harridan because it's a flying model. For 810 and 610 points respectively, they are also large investments, and if they don't perform, you're missing out on a lot of things you could have on the list alternatively. I think these units are now relegated to a place where you have an incredible understanding of the game, and you have a very good hold on how you can pilot your list. And quickly, just going through the we got some problems column. At the beginning, we have ranged warriors. They have a 4+ save. Their guns are not good. There's a lot lacking. Even though they went down to 65 points, they honestly are arguably worse than Hormagaunts, and Hormagaunts are faster and have better OC. I think they're kind of a waste of points at that point. Yeah, sure, Hive Guard went down to 100 points, but like I said in my video after the Munitorum Field Manual points, you would not invest 100 points into Hive Guard when you can invest 100 points into Zoanthropes. The Parasite of Mortrex is 80 points. He's the same as Death Leaper. He doesn't have an invuln. Sure, he's a lone op and he can deep strike, but he just dies. He dies to normal Marines in melee. There's rarely a time he can complete what you think he's able to do and what he's actually able to do. The Tyrannocyte is too many points. It is 110 points when a Rhino equivalent is 75. I think it should come down to those points. I don't care if it has a higher toughness or more wounds or guns. If it's going to be a delivery system for a monster, it should be a large monster, and it specifically has a restriction that it cannot bring monsters above 12 wounds, I believe. Toxicrin, I would love to actually work, but its profile is so large because of now, if you're able to see any part of the model, you can shoot the model. So it eternally will have cover, but it's going to blow up before you ever get into melee or ever able to use his mortal wounds ability. The Harpy and the Hive Crone are 215 points each. They're flyers. They're terrible. They're non-considerable for a list. If you play with one in your list, you are essentially down 215 points. Spore Mines are meme units. They cost so many points, and they are only point efficient into Knights. And then the remainder of the units here are Legends units, so you can use them in non-competitive play. The Dimacron I like, and the Malanthrop I like, but I don't believe there is a datasheet for the Crusher Carnifex or for the Meiotic Spores any longer. If for some reason there's something you feel I missed while going over this list, go ahead and tell me down in the comments. But I'm hoping to work on some innovations for this season with Crusher Stampede, and I'm excited to see what other people come up with in their other respective detachments. But thank you for joining me today. We have hit over 400 subscribers. I want to thank everybody who has come and listened to me and allowed me to be a helpful voice in the community. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something today, and I'll catch you next time. Hive Prometheus.